On today's panel, we have Daniel Kandad, who uses he/him pronouns. Daniel is currently an intermediate year law student. He has much experience in student leadership, and he is currently on the Law Students' Council as well as being the Speaker for Student Parliament. Daniel is very passionate about advancing the rights of students from marginalized groups, and I have no doubt that he's going to further the work of RainbowUCT next year when he's taking over as chairperson. Also, we're honored to have Professor Piero Fossio speaking. He uses he/him pronouns and is an expert.
You didn't ask me what my pronouns
Sorry. I picked up articles.
It was a bold assumption.
He is an expert in constitutional law and has written numerous articles on sexual orientation discrimination and same-sex marriage. He currently serves on the board of Penn SA and the advisory council of CASADCA, and he lectures in the public law department here at UCT. On the panel this evening, we also have Zola, who uses she/her pronouns and is a community engagement officer at the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation LGBTQ+ division. An activist at heart, Zola believes in fighting for the rights of the LGBTQIA+ people. In her role at this foundation, she is establishing peer-led transgender and gender-diverse safe spaces, as well as training for organizations across the country. This evening we also have Kamo Zulu, who is identifying as he, they, as their pronouns, and identifies as bisexual and has spent a few years doing work around bi-visibility and building community for bisexuals in South Africa. Due to the erasure and invalidation of non-monosexualities like bisexuality and pansexuality, even in queer spaces, Kamo is also doing their research around same-sex marriage rituals within the Zulu community, and which takes a standpoint on advocacy. He takes the standpoint on advocacy and reclaiming queer history within culture and our queer ancestry, as opposed to just the usual narrative, which is usually only rights-based. To start off, I wanted to ask Pierre, can you provide some context on the current state of LGBT rights in South Africa, and how do you feel this affects the daily engagements of people?
Yes, so obviously there is what is on paper, and then is what is lived. In terms of law and protection, for sexual orientation discrimination, actually, especially if you are in some kind of relationship, if you're in a same-sex relationship, you have more rights than in a heterosexual relationship that is not a marriage. Because before same-sex marriage came, the courts extended some of the rights that heterosexual married people would have to non-married same-sex partners, and those rights are still there unless they are taken away by Parliament. So formally, that is quite something. If you for transgender people, it is much different. There hasn't been really maybe the resources and for many other reasons the kind of things to drive a change in law through the courts, and of course access to gender-affirming care is there's no right to have such a thing, and the legislation that recognizes the alteration of sex description is a complete mess, and the Home Affairs people here again the gap between what is and how it works, who has to apply the law, even apply it more strictly than it should be. It is medicalizing trans issues. So there's a lot of work to do there. If you're an asylum seeker and you fled your country because you have a well-founded fear of being persecuted because you're trans or bisexual or gay or lesbian or whatever. The law is again very good, but if you go and you apply, the people there from Home Affairs are going to say, where's your proof that you are gay? You can show us nothing that show that you walked in a pride march in Kampala, and so we don't believe you. And of course, all of that happens in a context where you not only have an identity as a gay, bisexual, trans, lesbian, or whatever, you also have a racial identity, you have some other kind of identity in terms of man or woman, poor or rich or whatever. All of those things impact how the law can in fact protect you. And so, for some of us who are privileged, it's quite, compared to 30 years ago, I sort of came out of the closet. It's so different for me personally. I remember going to the first gay club in the early 1990s and, sneaking in, looking around, people are going to see. Yes, now it's very different for some of us at least.
Thanks for sharing that. I also remember my first time going to a gay club was kind of scary and also kind of snuck in. But things are very different now.
So can I maybe tell you just one thing? The thing is, of course, if you change the law, well, I was very naive. I thought we pass a constitution, it says no discrimination, everything changes. So about a few months after the 1994 election, I happened to be kissing a boy outside the Bronx, which was the gay bar, and a police van came. It was still those yellow apartheid police. And they got out, and the police officers, and they say, what is going on here? And I was like, we have a constitution now, stuff it. I was a bit drunk, maybe, sorry. And then, of course, afterwards you realize, it hasn't really changed it. It is on paper, but not further.
Well, it's great that the Constitution has advanced our rights so much. But speaking of healthcare, Zola, in your work, how do you find access to healthcare has been promoted in the last few years in terms of gender-affirming care and also healthcare for people who have diverse sexual orientations? And what sort of work do you think still needs to be done on this?
All right. So when it comes to healthcare, anything related to the LGBTI, more especially concerning gender-affirming healthcare, is dire, and the work that needs to be done there is so much. For an example, just now, Baragwanath is no longer providing gender-affirming surgeries at all. So therefore, in the entire South Africa, which leaves Grooteskier being the only hospital that provides such services. And within the Grooteskier gender-affirming healthcare clinic, only 4 days in a year is being set aside for operations, and then the waiting list has now lifted all the way from being 25 to 50 years. You know what I mean? So, and the adequate healthcare system or the healthcare that speaks to the LGBTI people in primary healthcare level is not there. Even though people are away, even though people, within our lives, because you obviously have a cousin, a sister, a brother, or someone that from your community that is within the LGBTI community, but still, when you are in that position, you come in with your own prejudices, even though you are there to render services, you come in with your own prejudices and then you exclude or discriminate against somebody who comes into the clinic asking for services. Speaking of which, if a gay man, just for an example, if a gay man comes into the clinic, saying that, they're experiencing some anal problems, the first thing, somebody who has no idea how to give healthcare services to an LGBTI person, their first diagnosis will be, you've got piles. Not even realizing that they've firstly discriminated against that person, because there's a lot. Just because, you're a gay man or you are a man, you come in and then you say you're experiencing, some anal problems. The only thing that could be wrong with you is ambeia, because that's literally the first thing they run into, that, it's ambeia, and also, besides the prejudices, the information or the knowledge, around the LGBTI people and the services or the care that speaks to them is absolutely not there. I mean, if our higher education system would at least include, curriculums that speaks to the health of the LGBTI people, I think that's one of the most important things that would help us so very much. And if our so very called, like Prof said, our so very called constitution can be enforced to the ground floor level, it would help us so very much.
Thank you. I see it's terrible how long those waiting lists are, and especially as you put that into perspective that there's really only 4 days that's dedicated towards that. I really hope that in the future things will advance, but at least in South Africa, we are starting with that, which unfortunately isn't seen in other African countries, but I think we can all be hopeful that the future will head that way. But speaking on discrimination, Samuel, I want to ask you about, in terms of the Zulu community, how would you say LGBT plus rights are viewed, and generally, how is the acceptance or lack thereof in the community?
That is a very good question, because there is no one clear answer to that. There are people within the Zulu community who are dead set to say that, this has never happened, this is wrong. You ask them why. Why do you say this is wrong? No, it's wrong. And they'll cite all of these other reasons, such as Bible verses and all of these other things that they want to revert to. Although, when you ask deeper, or even ask other people who are more willing to share on their experiences and their histories, they will say that, hey, this thing has always been there, although it's been there on the low. It's been the hush-hush. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about sex in general. So those kind of things were just secrets that people died with, and we don't want to talk about it further. So it becomes a two-way thing, where some people say, no, this is wrong, it's never been there. And you'll find even with people in power, and this is where I have the biggest problem, people like our former president, Jacob Zuma, who's also a Zulu man, making very harsh remarks around people who engage with, or people who identify as gay, lesbian, using Zulu words that to actually show that this thing was there. Because if there's a word for something, it means there's a history behind it. Using Zulu words and saying, if I can paraphrase, saying that if a gay man would stand in front of him, he would knock them out. Such a harsh statement, such a harsh homophobic statement said by someone with such power, nationally and within the Zulu culture, says a lot to me, and now also perpetuates a certain idea about where should the Zulu people's stance be on this matter.
All right, thanks. That is quite something to put into perspective how things are viewed in different communities. I know you also do a lot of work in terms of having visibility and exposure for bisexual people. How would you say that in traditional communities and also in South Africa as a whole is being advanced, even though we all know there's still discrimination and biphobia? How would you say things day to day are, and also generally, how would you describe that experience?
I feel like within the African sphere, more specifically with South Africa, because I wouldn't now want to push a bisexual movement within countries that are still are fighting for recognition and acceptance within their space as queer. Although in South Africa there is that legal protection, although then my problem, especially with bisexuality as a core element, there is the languaging behind it. You know, even the words such as, no, this is a gay marriage. But how do you know? Did you ask the people if they were? But if they're not, you know, it brings up this idea that that's erasure around bisexual people. That if you're with a woman or with your heterosexual partner, you automatically become straight, and then that erases your identity as a person. If you are in a relationship with a homosexual or same-sex partner, then you become homosexual. There is no identity for the bisexual people. And similarly so, even within spaces, once you come out as bisexual, you don't have a home anymore. You know, not necessarily in the literal sense, although with around straight homophobic people, you are now part of the gay group, you're part of the LGBT, you're no longer part of us, right? Although similar things tend to happen within queer spaces when you enter there and you're bisexual, and then these stereotypes start coming out as, no, you're bisexual, you know, you'll leave me for a heterosexual partner and you'll start a normal life and all of that. Such statements such as, no, bisexual people are cheating more, and all of those are small things that have a big impact within the bisexual space, especially when looking at stats. You know, bisexual people statistically have the majority within the LGBT community. Although if I may just go a bit deeper in all the work that is done that includes the LGBT, how many actually get to the bisexual people? You know, it leaves that open-ended question. When you look into, I'm a huge mental health advocate, I'd say, or mental health is one of my interests. Within the LGBT, it's known that statistically there is a high level of mental health illnesses such as depression, anxiety, which is also related to the lived experience. And bisexuals within that space have the highest of all of them. And now this is not being addressed, especially now within LGBT movements. And that's where my positionality comes into that, to want to redraw the B in LGBT.
That's amazing. I think it's so important to have bisexual voices in queer spaces because, as you say, there's a lot of erasure and a lot of people forgetting that people are bisexual when they step into opposite sex relationships. And speaking of that, Daniel, I wanted to know, so from a student perspective, and also as someone who's in a lot of student leadership positions, how do you feel that students or young people in general in South Africa go about their lived realities in terms of having constitutional protection rights, but also being young people, often from communities where they might get discriminated against or that are in situations where they can't always be themselves? How do you find their reality is on campus amongst each other?
So I think I'll speak from the perspective of not being an expert on the student life aspects of the university, which I think are offered to students. Generally, my sense of it is that the interaction is good. I think that South African young people especially do understand that they live in a society which affords us a certain regime of civil protections if you're an LGBTQ person. And I don't think that that's lost on South African people, regardless of where you come from. And I'm always comparing it to my own kind of cultural backdrop, which is I'm South African, but I'm from Iran and Pakistan. So there are worse places to be gay. There are places with the penal code as a death penalty on it for the crime of aggravated homosexuality. Although I always wonder how you're going to prove aggravated part of the aggravated homosexuality, but yeah, so I think over here, I always love, especially coming back to South Africa from the Middle East, where you do, I think as an LGBTQ person, feel that sense of exhale, that you can kind of relax, right? Which is important, and I think that contradiction is not lost on your average UCT student or in South Africa people who understand that, as you said, in other parts of the continent, that's not a reality. In other parts of the world, that's not a reality. And I think that makes it so interesting to be at UCT, to be at Africa's, not just South Africa's, but Africa's leading institution of higher learning, because we have the ability here to set a standard, right? I was speaking to another really great law student the other day. He's from Zim, and he said, universities like UCT are educating and training the next generation of African leaders, of African intelligentsia, and so the cultural impact that their education and the time they spend here leaves on them is incredibly important. Obviously, there are serious, I think, disparities. I really liked someone had a quote about they want the protection of the Constitution to hit the ground level. I think you mentioned that, which is that's probably the best way of putting it. But from a South African perspective, I tend to think that we're doing well, right? Touch wood. As Prof said, there are some civil protections that are offered to LGBTQ persons. It's funny, I was in Iran to see my grandmother for a few weeks in July, and it's almost strangely reversed there, where you have, interestingly, a certain amount of legal protections afforded to transgendered people because of the history there. And you have people from across the Middle East who come to Iran to do gender-affirming surgery because Iran is a specialist in that regionally. But the juxtaposition of then there is a death penalty for homosexuality. It's interesting. And I think one of the questions I hope that we can answer next year, or at least speak more about, is that 30-year-long success story that Prof was speaking about. How can we set a model for that to be implemented across the region, right? So that you can have a pride parade in Kampala, right? So I hope that next year we can, and this year, we can start having those interesting conversations and seeing how we can do that using this amazing platform.
Great. Can I
Sure.
maybe comment or ask a question of everybody else? I've been thinking about this because so many countries, the LGBTQ community becomes a scapegoat for the politics that go wrong. Then you must pick somebody to blame. In South Africa, foreigners from the rest of our continent are blamed for everything, but not gay men, lesbians, trans people. So maybe there's something hopeful about that also. I mean, it's very depressing kind of hopeful, but I'm wondering what that is. Is there not an opportunity to, there's something there that makes us, we're not necessarily so special, but that makes South Africa a bit unique compared to these other countries, which is, I don't know why exactly it is, but it's interesting.
Here in South Africa, that's probably largely because of our history of coming out of oppressive regimes like apartheid and having groups of people that had been oppressed previously standing up and having a platform to stand up and be able to be afforded protection, whereas we haven't really had much of any advancement for refugees or people coming from any other African countries coming here and seeking protection. That sort of protection hasn't exactly been extended as much as it should be in terms of having people afforded rights and not just be given blame for things. So I think in future that would be great if those groups of people could also have their interests advanced. Anyone else?
But within this beautiful South Africa and its beautiful constitution, that uniqueness that we so very much have and so very proud of, if you're somebody who works in the community, who are amongst these people, and you go into the rural places in South Africa, that is a totally different case. I mean, just last month, we were in Karoo, doing advocacy day in Karoo, doing social orientation, gender identity expression training in the Karoo. The level of violence that we were met with there was just too much. We had to have police, at the gate, at the venue where we were, simply because the Desmond Tutu van had an LGBTI flag on it, and these people were like, well, we are there to teach their kids how to be gay. Basically, that's what we were there to do, you know what I mean? We were there to teach their kids how to be gay. Their kids are not gay, So I just kind of feel like, yes, we have a beautiful constitution, but it just goes up to it has just its bias. It goes up to a level. It does not reach where it's supposed to reach. Like, we were never in touch wood. Like, I just kind of feel like we're getting to a place where everybody, not just in Cape Town alone, is able to say, I am able to express my own gender identity and expression the way I want to. I can be as flamboyant as I want to, and I can be as ambiguous as I want to. In the Karoo as well, or in the rural Eastern Cape as well, where no culture or religion will have to dictate that, this is what a man should do, and this is what a man should do, and this is how a man dresses, and this is how a woman dresses, and there's just no in between. Like, this is where I have a problem with our so very much beautiful constitution. Like, it's just there in paper. It's just there in paper, but it does not work for us, and also, I'm going to say this to everybody in this room. We have the knowledge. That's the thing. We have the knowledge. And because we go to these Ivy League schools, we have the knowledge and we gain this knowledge into these beautiful schools. But we never really go back home, and disseminate this knowledge to the people that actually do deserve it so much that they can change. Yes, our Gen Zs, they're doing the most. Them Gen Zs are doing the most. Oh, they are changing narratives, Gen Zs. And we are watching them and feeling like, oh, these kids, they're just being kids because they were born in the 2000s, They're teaching our parents that, no, you don't do this, you don't do that. But we have the information. We have the, they don't necessarily have the statistics, the research, all they have is that I am going to experience who I am the way I want to, and that's it, I'm going to live my life. But we have the knowledge, but we never go back into those right-wing groups and say, you know what? We have the information, allow me to educate you. If you take it, you take it. If you don't take it, you don't take it. It's up to you. But then we give that information to make it easier for the next generation to come. Because trust me, we will never be the only ones who are LGBTI. There were those before us, they did not lay a good path for us. And we are still doing the same thing, really. We're not laying a good path. Hence the disparity in gender-affirming healthcare. I mean, you mean to tell me that there never was a trans person ever in South Africa? Yes, there were. There always were. It's just that there was no research done to enforce, lawmakers or rule makers that, this is actually a need, and therefore we should make this need a priority. How is it that in an institution like UCT, the faculty of science, they don't teach gender affirming surgeries? Like, how is that even possible? How do we have one doctor that we rely on in the whole of Cape Town to perform these surgeries, and then the rest of the other surgeons will just do an aftercare? How is that even possible? But it's just
Thank you for that. And I want to add on to that, because oftentimes I feel like we forget how unequal South Africa is. So South Africa does have the reality, which is a true reality, of being a rainbow nation, of having a constitution, of having the acceptance and the inclusion. But wait, And there's also the reality of people. I think I was watching a documentary as I was preparing for my research. A documentary that happened, I think in 2020, just 3 years ago, in Khayelitsha. And there was a lesbian woman in that video who sleeps with a golf stick in hand, just to make sure that they can make it to the next day. So in the same South Africa, we have two separate realities of people living out and being able to be themselves, and a reality of people who are still being killed on a day-to-day for just being themselves. And this is a story that now comes to me, especially every time we come to this discussion around pride. And pride at the same time at these two different places means two different things, because pride is a celebration. When you have the access to the place where you can be, but pride is still a struggle. Pride is still a protest in the places where people die on a daily, saying that no, we deserve to exist, we deserve to live, we deserve to be seen. So in this pride thing, I love how you mentioned it. There's disparities even within the law, and the law is there for everybody, but where is the law actually in place? Especially when we look into things like when was it again, the pride marches. And this is where I find a clear differentiation between the pride that happens in more affluent places, such as here in Cape Town. And I'm going to say this now with my chest, that in Cape Town we can see the disparity of pride every year happening at the Green Point. And I don't know, maybe someone has the stats on how many LGBT people get harassed or get or experience violence or discrimination in that specific area, because it's, as far as I know, it's the gayest place in Africa. That's what social media says. But then just a few kilometers away, we have places where people are still being murdered, bodies are being found, and this is a reality that is so gruesome, it keeps me up at night, that this too happens. And I heard discussions around there being a Khayelitsha Pride also, trying to bring that awareness where the awareness is needed. In the same way we find this disparity even within Joburg. There's the main Joburg Pride, and then there's the Soweto Pride that is less funded, And this is where the money comes into this conversation, because as South Africa, we cannot have the conversation around pride without having the conversation around identity and the economy, and where the economy lies within the space, So pride and the reality of many LGBT people, including myself, becomes then a story of becoming, leaving the place that you couldn't accept who you were, where you couldn't express who you were, and usually going to these metropolitan cities like Joburg and Cape Town, trying to find a space that would be inclusive for you to kind of exist, to kind of first and foremost just breathe and just be you in that space there, because you know where you're coming from. You can't.
So I want to make 2 points that more or less agreeing, but maybe slightly different. The first thing is that, of course, the law is just the start. The law cannot change people's attitudes. It cannot stop somebody being homophobic. Maybe over 50 years, yes, slowly, but the law cannot change the Catholic Church into an institution that's embracing of people who are different, or the Ingekerk or whatever. But the important point for me is of this whole discussion is that if we think it's Pride Month, we want to think about our own identity as if we live in a complete cocoon, which is the danger, which I think you are saying, that if we think about justice, it is not just about equality for gay men, for gay white men. It is about poverty, it's about money, it's about whether you're a man or a woman, it's about sexism. And I think the difficulty we have in any kind of politics is to find that kind of solidarity and making common cause with people who are oppressed maybe in different ways. So if you're a white gay man living in Sea Point, it's important to try and make common cause with somebody who might live in Kailicha, who don't have money or whatever. So that the politics that happens is not a politics of people sitting in their own little silo. Yeah, so I think I'm quite passionate about it.
Thank you for those perspectives. I think it's amazing how we can all understand pride in different ways in terms of seeing how we've experienced it ourselves and how we've viewed it from others, and how we see there's still a need for so much advocacy amongst the community members. Daniel, I want to know from you, from a student perspective, how would you say students and young people in general can better advocate for the community? Do you think that there's any particular way that's a good way of going about educating others? Because I think as young people, it can be quite challenging trying to always have that burden of speaking to, say, older relatives and having to say, trying to educate other people.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I'm the perfect person to answer that question, but obviously the first part of the answer is to get around panels like this and places like this and have the kind of discussions that we're having. The other part that I think is super important is just the idea of representation. I think it's helpful to, it sounds almost simple and idiotic. What I want to say is just be yourself, right? Live your truth is what people like to say. I lived many years of my life just being very insecure about this idea that, I have this problem, people are going to find out about this problem. And the more that you open yourself up to people, and I think handle yourself on a day-to-day basis, being honest with people, you'll spread that kind of energy and that spirit or culture of openness will spread and develop. I think, as we've touched on, that's probably easier to do here at UCT, right? And we should remember that. But like Prof was touching on, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. Making those connections is important. I really liked this year, and part of the reason I became so interested in RainbowUCT was the demonstration that RainbowUCT did this year against, or I shouldn't say against, but demonstration in welcome of the speaker who came to campus. As it should be, because we should respect freedom of speech, of course, but we should also be willing to stand up for values that we think are super important. And so I think that's the best way, we can do it as students to get involved and to get active. Hopefully going forward, societies, we're gonna have full rooms when we do events, which is difficult coming back from that COVID dynamic. But yeah, I in terms of UCT, if I'm speaking from the perspective of students, I don't think that we're doing that bad. Although that said, I hear a lot of weird stories about residences. I'm not on a residence, I'm not from a residence, so I don't know. I can't attest to the culture that persists there or doesn't. But generally, I think, we're doing well and to keep kind of persisting.
I feel like with young people, sometimes it is so much easier. I think especially in Cape Town, generally having conversations around homophobia. I think, for instance, I was speaking to some school learners this year, and I was saying to them, a good way of sort of gauging if your parents or family are a bit homophobic is put on Love, Simon, which is this movie. It's about this young high school boy who starts falling in love with this other boy. I was like, if you guys just watch that with them, gauge their reactions, ask them what they thought of the movie. So it's a good indicator, and I feel like in 2023 in areas like Cape Town, it's so much easier to start these conversations since we have media and just general more welcoming views. but I see that, well, I understand rather, in so many communities, there isn't that understanding. I wanted to ask, in terms of the Desmond Tutu Foundation, I know there's a lot of work done there about HIV/AIDS prevention. How would you say that sort of intersection between, it's always historically been discrimination against the gay community with HIV, and how would you say the Desmond Tutu Foundation in particular approaches sort of conversations with educating queer people, but without just sort of having any stereotypes around the community?
So HIV, as we historically know it, apparently it comes from us. Don't know how that happened, but anyways. Within the organization itself, so the organization firstly started off as a general population sort of HIV and AIDS organization, and then the year 2003, right just after so many LGBTI people, more especially gay men, were dying of AIDS and whatnot, then they decided that, you know what, let's look at this community, like what's happening here, like what's the problem, and how can we try and shift focus and lend a helping hand here. And what we found was that, number one, the stereotype around us being the one who are carrying the virus and spreading the virus was the number one reason why gay men, or I'll say gay men especially, would not necessarily want to go to a clinic to go test, because the minute you're a gay person and you go into the clinic, it's sort of like, oh my gosh, that they're HIV positive and they're gonna die, and now we have to exclude them, and all of that. So the culture of matching HIV and AIDS with gay people has literally always been there, and how we've tried to sort of how we try to sort of dismantle that discrimination is to actually do the research and try to work towards saying that, gay men are not necessarily carrying around HIV and AIDS. They're not, going around spreading HIV and AIDS. It's not a gay man or lesbian woman thing. It's a human disease, and the information that we have, thus, we spread it with the community, and we try to educate the community as much as we can around HIV and AIDS, and coming up with, purpose 1, purpose 2, that is your PrEP injections, for the MSM community, and making sure that, this specific community that has always been marginalized or being discriminated against or being known as the AIDS carrier, is sort of what being taken care of, so that when they do their census and then they can see that, actually it's a general population thing, gay men are not necessarily dying of AIDS now, so they're not the carriers of this disease. Everybody is, and everybody can spread it in any way.
Thanks for the information. It's great to see how we're, as a society, progressing more in terms of that. I wanted to know if there are any questions from our audience. The gentleman, the person in the white shirt.
It's more of a comment on what was said earlier. So I think a really important part that was maybe left out in the conversation is the decolonial project, but not just the question of are we going to decolonize, but also why are we not decolonizing, because the initiatives are there. As you said, the knowledge is there. We know the stuff. They're not just UCT. There are many great universities in South Africa that have done really great work on the topic. But I think a lot more attention needs to be paid to what is keeping us from making the progress? Where are the resources being allocated, and why? And it's very relevant to this conversation as well, because decoloniality is not just let's learn in Xhosa. It's not just let's abandon English. It's not that. It's also our culture, how we move among other people. Do we help other people? It's embedded so much in the individual that it affects every conversation that we have. It affects conversations like this, where intersectionality isn't anymore about sexuality and race and where you live and whether pride is in Greenpoint or Khayelitsha, but it's more about I think as you said as well, the cultures in South Africa and even Africa at large, and how they are limited and aren't moving anywhere.
Thanks so much for that comment. It's definitely something that's thoughts that are really good to engage with for all of us. I just wanted to know if there's a question.
Thank you very much. Mine is less of a question and more of commentary. I think a lot of valid points have been, brought up in the discussion, and I think from various different perspectives. But I think fundamentally there is a deep politicized approach to all these things from certain people. Like I know, for example, the Black people try to really outline that the Constitution works, but it works for a certain kind of people. But this is not something that's unique to queerness or gender or anything like that. It is the logic of our colonial past. It is the logic of colonialism. It is how it works. It separates people, and South Africa or Cape Town being like the capital of, I guess, queerness when Pride Month comes along in Africa is nothing, it's not unique, It's the reason why that is because white people hold so much of our wealth in the country. It's no coincidence that we have the biggest gap between rich and poor, and in that very same country, queer rights are mostly for white people, because the Constitution may be great for queer people, but if we go to Menenberg, the Constitution is not working for people in Menenberg. It's not working for the people who suffer corrective rape and all these kinds of things. So I think it's necessary that we look at queer relations and oppression in a queer sense, and also related to the racial aspect, as well as the gendered aspect, and as well as any other aspect, because I don't think it helps us to look at these relations and say, and build entire studies around it, and separate it from the fact that there is a certain kind of logic inherent within the state, the settler colonial state, and how it operates. So these things are not different. And I also think that in terms of going forward, Vladimir Lenin asked a very valid question long ago. It was, what is to be done? And I think that always needs to be central in these panel discussions. And I think it doesn't help us to think, okay, perhaps we ought to educate, the health science department about this, or maybe law studies has to be a certain way. I think we need to fundamentally look at what is the underpinning modalities of this society and why does it do the things that it do. So in other words, why is it that our education system is trained to produce super capitalists who come out and go into a job and perform the job and go back home, instead of people who go into university, look at queer studies, look at sociology, look at law, and try to come up with new perspectives, fresh perspectives on what is to be done once more. So in that perspective, we can tell that it's never going to help us if we keep having discussions and keep saying, these spaces, we can ask so many questions, so many nice questions. Because these questions are being asked in middle class spaces. They're being asked at UCT. Like I know someone in the panel was saying that, South Africa is better than other places, but for who? Who is it better than? Because relative to my own space, I don't feel that. I'm not in America or in other places. I exist where I exist, and where I exist hurts. So in that sense, we have to look at this very, very politically and align with the other people who are driving the forces of political change within society. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I love the two previous questions because I think it touches on something important, and it's kind of it was a conversation I was having yesterday before I knew I was going to be on this panel. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is she's a law student, she's from Rwanda. And it's kind of the question that was at the end that was implicit at the end of your statement. You said a decolonial approach in how we observe LGBTQ emancipation, right, which would be my goal, necessarily involves a decolonial approach. And I think that's correct, but it's also interesting, right? If you go to Uganda, if you go to Iran, and you have a conversation with people about what decoloniality means to them, it's the antithesis of LGBTQ rights. Why? Because they view them as an importation, and I think it's desperately incorrect. But they view it as an importation of foreign propaganda, right? Of Western imperial, and if you ask my friend, she will say South Africa doesn't, in the context of this conversation, South Africa counts as Western imperial. So Western imperial political forces, sometimes the view on the ground level of many societies is that this is not African, this is not Middle Eastern, this is a Western importation of culture, right? So in those contexts, I'm very concerned about a conversation about decoloniality because it means the opposite of what you here are saying that it means and that it should mean, right? And ultimately, the question that we're trying to answer together is, so what is our culture, right? You said that it is important to go back to a point of reference in our culture where we have an idea that LGBTQ emancipation existed in perpetuity. To my mind, I don't think it ever existed, right? So to me, anywhere. So to me, we're always moving from point of nothing, right? And to me, point of nothing is that if my friend was in a classroom at the University of Tehran or in Isfahan, he wouldn't be able to say that. He wouldn't be able to say that. If he did, he would be reported on to the Bushk, and then later someone's going to come knock on someone's door. Are you the person who was at an event spreading Western Israeli American propaganda? That's how it, right? So with that context, I think it's important to find some sense of fraternity is not the right word, but some sense of collegiality within the movement, exactly what Professor was saying, to find that we come from this with very different perspectives and backgrounds, and those narratives are incredibly important. But what's the goal, right? So to me, the goal is, for South Africa especially, which I view as an unfinished, successful work as it pertains to LGBTQ emancipation, but for Africa and the continent, right? For South Africa and the continent, I think that question of where we see ourselves is incredibly important. You're never going to change people's attitudes. My grandmother is always going to be a homophobic woman. You're not going to change her mind. She doesn't understand it, right? If you ask her, there's two gay guys, she can't. She doesn't have the cultural context to be able to, for me to explain to her, this is a dude, right? We sleep together. He's coming over for food. She's not going to get it. And so, to my mind, with that cultural context, legal emancipation is incredibly important. That has to be the foundation. But slowly over time, you start working on fixing cultural attitudes, right? And I think you touched on that very correctly. It's honestly about money. My sister, she's married congratulations, she married to a Brazilian guy. They live in the States. And the trajectory of how gay emancipation, or at least one of the barometers we tend to use, I don't know why, but gay marriage for gay emancipation. In the US, if you asked people in 2013, they would tell you this fight is 20, 30 years away from being won. just that issue of gay marriage. Gay marriage, 30 years, not in the United States. Half of the country is incredibly religious. They have the massive capture of political power. You're not going to get it. And then you had a Supreme Court decision, right, which changed that. So I think that there are ways in which we can push to jump step on this ladder of emancipation. But to really get there, yeah, you're right, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take money, investment. It's going to take, what made my aunt, I'll give an example, very nice woman. You know what got her okay with the idea of gay men? She watches Modern Family. Have you guys seen that show? Such a cute, funny show, right? She's just watching it, and then after months she realizes they're not so bad, right? So a TV show with a lot of money and Hollywood pizzazz behind it, a real yardstick for imperialism, it helped on this issue. So the conversation is complicated, right? And it's complicated considering, yes, the South African example is very, very important. But I do think it's important to recognize the extent to which successes and gains have been made here, which they have. It's undeniable, right? 30 years ago when Prof came out of the closet, or just before that, he would have been potentially arrested, right? So that is different. That does mean something. I'm slightly older, I think, than your average student, not much, but slightly. I remember in grade 11 and grade 10, being chased around by these very nasty kids, being called all sorts of words. That would not happen today. In many South African schools, if a teacher is present, right? I had that happen to me when a teacher was present standing right there. And maybe the idea in his mind was, boys will be boys, they're gonna toughen up. There are slow and incremental ways in which I think culture is moving. Many ways to go, 100%. But it reminds me of the importance of the idea that you should gather the movement that you have, try to make it work, and then push for the remaining gains to be made.
Want to add to that?
Yes. I love the conversation around queer and decolonization at the same time, because I find that in this context, you can't unjoin the two. Specifically in Africa, especially even with the legal gains, South Africa legalizing and legally protecting same-sex people and legalizing same-sex marriage was a decolonial stance, And why I'm going to say that is when we look at the history of the colonial agenda, and we're going to look at coloniality and how coloniality also enforced the ways of being, the ways of knowing, So with the colonial agenda came the idea that sex is only for procreation, limiting it to man and woman because that's what's supposed to be. So undoing that is a decolonial standpoint because before that wasn't the case, Knowing our histories and looking at culture, I actually have a problem now with the word culture because it freezes it in time. Thinking of culture as something that happened way back then, because the further you go back, the more changes you actually see happened. Culture, as we know it now, wasn't the same 100 years ago, wasn't the same 200 years ago. Culture evolves, which is why in my language, I'm Zulu, we call it isintu, which isi means, it's a singular prefix. Ntu means people, so isintu is the way of the people, the way the people live. So change is a constant in life, and isintu changes across time and will forever change to adapt to the current circumstances. Which is why I feel like even within these conversations around LGBT matters, especially in Africa, there is a big need. Yes, there is a need for us to go for legal changes and coming out, coming in and aiding people who need the help, because there is a very genuine need. But there's also a need for us to now switch this a little bit, because coming in from the outside, coming in with even the words we're kind of using, LGBT, gay, lesbian, these are all words in a specific language, in a specific context, with a specific history that is different from the people who you're trying to, and it might come across as, hey, you're trying to teach us new things, but in this whole conversation, when are we saying, hey, no, you see this thing? It relates to Usbanban and Usbanban and how they used to live. Remember your grandmother who never got married? This is why they never got, oh, okay, light bulb moment. Because homosexuality, and with now removing the word gay and homosexual, people of the same sex enjoying sex and intimacy with each other has a long history in Africa. Even right here in South Africa, being trans has history here in South Africa. It has been known, it has been documented, especially by, especially with the trans thing. It was this sexologist from 1900, from the year 1900, who documented and actually was one of the first people to say, okay, no, I found a person who appears to be male, but they're dressed in and live in a way of what is a woman. Okay, I'll call this cross-dressing, but it's different from this. He's actually one of, I'll get the name for it. That person I just forgot, but what I'm trying to push is there is a history here, especially if up in North Africa. Uganda is one of the most homophobic countries at the moment, but it also has a very deep, intimate relationship with same-sex activities happening, especially between men. That was known publicly in their space. So now coming in, erasing that, and pushing the agenda that, okay, no, we're teaching you how to accept people having sex together, you know, modern family, and all of that is coming in from the outside only, but we also need that push from the inside to say, no, remember yourself. Because our history is now, with the LGBT movement, I feel it does at some points come across as it's coming in, and the knowledge is one-sided and it's not being co-created. So the knowledge is just pushed in and not trying to understand. In South Africa, in each and every language, there is a word that refers to a homosexual person or someone who does not fit neatly into the gender binary, if there is one binary within culture, which I'm also assuming there wasn't, especially now looking back into culture, because my uncle is Umalume, and my uncle's wife can also be called Umalume, and that's no big deal. There is no gendered language in my own language. So it comes across as those things as we're now becoming more, what's the word? What's this word of? We're becoming now more inclusive and we're becoming more progressive. Progressive now becomes the counter of culture, which was actually not the case, because culture, in how we are trying to frame it, is stuck in time and not realizing that culture was very broad and dynamic and used to exist in many different forms and ways, and queerness, in how we like to think of it, existed then in many different ways that they found it would happen, that would work for them. And now we just need to just tie that in with the now and say that actually was kind of progressive, and this is what we're trying to do. We have the same goal at hand. So us doing this again in silos does not, for me, make a lot of sense. We need to join these two very important movements together because we are all going towards the same point.
Thanks so much for that. I think this evening had some amazing perspectives being shown. I don't know if anyone has anything they would like to add still to that. No. I think there's just one more question. Would you like to ask?
I don't know, it's a combination of a question and a comment. And it is a lot of we're talking about, a lot of what you guys have been talking about. Yes, we had a discussion of gender-affirming care for trans people, but I'd love to hear more about non-binary and non-male transition, and how people have found the experience of, and as like non-binary people, personally as a non-binary person, even at UCT, I have had issues with people accepting their pronouns in a course called gender and history, where we were looking at gender affirming care in South Africa, I had my tutor misgendered me right after giving my pronouns. I had my classmates misgendering me right after giving my pronouns. And this despite being in a course that is about gender. So I just, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that experience with us. I think it's important to know that even at a very progressive university, there's still so much to still be done, especially when there are courses on gender, and even people that are teaching those courses needing to learn a bit more. I think we don't really have that much time left with the panelists now, but afterwards we've got some cupcake stalls, so if anyone would like to chat, I'm sure our panelists wouldn't mind, and enjoy the cupcakes. But thank you so much to everyone who's been here tonight and shared their perspectives. I really appreciate all the expertise, and I think we all give a big round of applause to the panelists.